So let's start today's class. This week's Parsha is Parshat Beshalach. And I want to begin with a little story or an episode that I remember reading that the Lubavitcher Rebbe shared. In a letter to the Israeli president in 1956, the Rebbe wrote the following. From the time that I was a child attending Cheder, and even earlier than that, the vision of the future redemption began to take form in my imagination. The redemption of the Jewish people from their final exile. A redemption of such magnitude and grandeur that through it, the purpose of the sufferings, harsh decrees, and anguish of exile will be understood. And I remember reading this and thinking, wow, from the time that the Rebbe was a young child, the Rebbe was already starting to envision, what will the world look like when Mashiach comes? What will it be like? And perhaps this explains the Rebbe's obsession with talking about Mashiach and preparing our generation for Mashiach's coming, because it was so much a part of ingrained in the Rebbe from a very, very young age. Why do I begin today's Parsha class with this episode? Because this week's Parsha, we continue learning about the final and very dramatic moments of the Jewish people's exodus from Egypt. In this week's Parsha, the Parsha begins describing the splitting of the sea. And in this narrative, we read something very, very interesting. So the Jewish people are standing at the shores of the Red Sea. Under the direction of their leader Moshe, the sea split. They all crossed over on dry land. And what do? They break out in song. They start singing Az Yashir. It's called the Shirat Hayam, a song expressing their enormous gratitude and thanksgiving to Hashem. And as soon as Moshe and the nation concluded their song, the Torah says something very interesting. And let me pull it up on the screen so you can share along with me. I'm sorry that I forgot to share this sooner. Here we go. So this week's Parsha, Parshat Beshalach, I titled today's class, A Yearning for Mashiach. So in the second slide, we read about what happens right after Moshe finishes his song. Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women came out after her with tambourines and with dances. And Miriam called out to them, "Sing to the Lord, for very exalted is he." Okay, so we have this the Torah describes this very dramatic and very special moment that Moshe and the men sang their song, and then Miriam and the women rose to sing their song. But what's interesting is that the Torah describes that the men sang with their voices, very nice and lovely, but the women's song was special, was unique, because the women's song involved not only voice, but instruments, their tambourines, and dance. So there was something about the joy that the women felt in their hearts. They were so full of joy, and their song and their dance and their music was so much more comprehensive. And the Torah actually explains that in a lot of ways, Miriam and the women singing surpassed the men's singing and the men's song. So let's delve into this a little bit more, and I'm going to bring up the Rashi, who is one of the basic commentaries on the Torah. So Rashi, I quoted two Rashis here for you. The first one we'll glance over. We'll come back to it a little later in the class. And the second one is the one I want to focus on today. So first of all, Rashi asks, why in this verse is Miriam called the prophetess, Aaron's sister? Like she has like two descriptive, words associated with her name. So the answer is, and Rashi explains, when did she prophesy or prophecy? When she was known only as Aaron's sister, before Moshe was born. She said, my mother is destined to bear a son who will save Israel. And this Rashi quotes from the Talmud. So we will get to this a little later, but just briefly, if you're familiar with the story, but Paro decreed that all baby boys should be thrown into the Nile River. And Miriam's mother and father actually thought that it would be best in this case if they were to divorce, because why bring more children into the world that are going to be killed? But Miriam at that moment, and the Torah just says that Miriam was 6 years old, 6, and she prophesied, and she just instinctively knew that her mother and father were destined to bear a son that will save the Jewish people. And so she told her parents, what you're doing is actually worse than Paro's decree. Paro is making a decree against all the Jewish baby boys. But by you separating, you are also preventing baby girls from being born. And her words were so wise and so true that her parents actually got back together. And Miriam and Aaron were siblings. Their parents were very well respected in the community, Amram and Yocheved. And when Amram and Yocheved got back together, then many, many other couples got back together, and many Jewish baby boys and baby girls were born from Miriam's prophecy. So that's the first Rashi. But the second Rashi is what I want to focus on. Rashi asks a very good question. Rashi wants to understand, how did these women that just left Mitzrayim, that just left Egypt, how did these women have tambourines with them? They left in haste. They're running with like just the dough on their back, right? The dough didn't even have enough time to rise for bread. They had matzah to eat, but they had tambourines. So Rashi says something so special, and I'll quote Rashi. The righteous women of that generation were so certain that the Holy One, blessed be He, would perform miracles for them, that they took tambourines out of Egypt. So just imagine the scene, right? They're running out of Egypt in haste because Moshe says, we gotta leave. We gotta leave now before Paro changes his mind. They hardly have time to pack. They hardly have time to bake bread, right? But somehow they lived in a higher dimension, like beyond like the natural reality. And despite their haste, the women prepared well in advance something that they felt would be essential. That means in the crux of their pain and in their suffering and in the most difficult times of their enslavement, the Jewish women are preparing tambourines. Why are they preparing tambourines? Because they know and they believe that if Hashem told us He will take us out of Mitzrayim, He will. They believed with such earnest faith and trust that they were ready with their tambourines in a certain spot, so that as soon as Hashem said it's time to go, they grabbed the tambourines and they went. And it wasn't only the tambourines, but remember what the Torah describes. They had songs prepared, dances prepared. So imagine if all of us in 2021 have Zoom gatherings where we prepare dances and music, accompaniment with songs for the moment that Mashiach comes. This is literally what the women in the generation of Egypt did. And it is so, so inspiring, right? Remember, what's on these minds of these women who had seen so much affliction beyond the human breaking point? What was on the hearts of these women that were carrying so much pain, so much anguish? That they were worn, they were tired, they were tortured, they were beaten. The tambourines, instruments with which to sing and praise Hashem, their God, for the miracles they knew would come to be. So the women never lost hope. And they somehow found the strength to fortify themselves in such a way, even in their most difficult moments. And it doesn't end here. But when you read about the Jewish women's experience during those times, you read about such hope and such faith and such trust. It is incredible. We read in previous Torah portions how the lives of the Jewish slaves it was terrible. It was bitter. It was brutal. The physical labor was backbreaking. The moral toll that took on everybody was so heavy. The family unit was shattered. Husband and wives were separated. The people were demoralized. They were depressed. They had no more dignity, no more self-respect. And not only that, but the Torah actually describes that they almost completely, they were like numb. The Jewish nation's heart became dull and numb, like too worn to even have any faith, except for one segment of the population, one segment of the Jewish nation. One part of the nation did not succumb and carried in their hearts an inextinguishable spark of optimism. And who were these people? This group of slaves were the Jewish women. They continued every single day to believe in a better life. They encouraged their families daily with like superhuman strength. The Torah describes how after an exhausting day of excruciating labor, the women would polish their mirrors and use them to beautify themselves for their husbands. And at night, they would sneak out of the men's camp and they would sneak out to the men's camp and bring hot food. And they would heat water in the field and bathe their husbands' wounds. And they would speak soft, soothing words to their husbands. And the Medrash describes that they would tell their husbands, do not lose hope. And they would tell their sons, don't worry, we have Hashem's promise that he will redeem us. And many women conceived during these visits and giving birth to the children who would ensure the continuity of the Jewish people. So the question is, how did these Jewish women have this strength? Where do they have this strength from? How did they have the ability and to not lose hope even for one moment, right? These same women who had songs and dances and instruments prepared for the day that they would leave Egypt. Where do they get the strength from? And the answer is they got the strength from their teacher and their leader. And her name was Miriam. Talmud says that there were three excellent leaders for the Jewish people: Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Actually, three siblings. Moshe and Aaron were leaders for all the people, but Miriam was the leader for the women. And she was a teacher who led by example. Where did she get her courage and her vision from? Like such a powerful woman. So the Torah actually explains that Miriam's name has two meanings, and both meanings of her name help explain or exemplify the qualities of her character. So Miriam, first and foremost, comes from the root word mar. In Hebrew, mar means bitter. So Miriam was born at a time when the oppression of the exile had reached its peak, its worst, right? Vayimararu es chayehem. The Egyptians embittered the Jewish people's lives with hard work. We see this word embittered, Miriam, right? She felt the bitterness of her people, and her earliest years were formed by this heartbreaking reality of bitterness. But with all the bitterness that she lived through and she experienced, she had this like inextinguishable hope for a better future. She would not, there was no way that she was going to allow herself to get caught in the bitterness, to get stuck in the bitterness. And this leads us to the other meaning of Miriam's name, and that is rebellion. Miriam can also come from the root word meri. Meri in Hebrew means to rebel. So despite being born into the most difficult period of oppression, Miriam rebelled from her earliest age against the slave mentality. She felt the pain. She felt the pain sharply. She felt the anguish of her people, but she refused to succumb to fear. She refused to succumb to despair, and she bravely and resolutely kept vigilant, kept watch over the faith in the promise of redemption. And the Torah tells us so much about Miriam's resolution to do whatever it takes to keep the state of her family and her people in the right frame of mind and to never lose hope. And we read so much about Miriam and Miriam's life story and how she exemplified both these character traits. She lived in a bitter time, but Mary, she rebelled against it. She refused to succumb. We know that Miriam's service as a midwife, she refused to obey Pharaoh's decree to murder the baby boys, right? She was only 5 years old at that time, but she stood up to the mightiest ruler on earth. She actually spoke back to him and said, "No, I will not listen to you, Pharaoh." And this was Miriam. This was the mother of redemption. It was Miriam's insistence that her parents came back together, right? Another example of Miriam's just her enduring faith. She believed in a promising future, right? We also have Miriam's commitment to watch over her baby brother Moshe, right? When Moshe was born and they had to put him somewhere safe so he wouldn't be murdered, Moshe's mother Yocheved put him in a basket on the Nile River. And Miriam watched over her baby because it was her prophecy, like we read in Rashi. It was her prophecy that her mother would give birth to a baby who would redeem the Jewish people. And Miriam was there standing watch on the bank of the Nile as her entire nation's future hung in the balance, right? Over the state of this infant floating in the water. But never did her faith in the Geula, in the redemption, falter. And as the leader of the women, Miriam imbued this quality in their hearts. And it is this quality that empowered these women, these righteous women, to be the spreaders of the redemption. And what the women of this generation had was a leader who inspired them every single day of their life to think about Mashiach. Every single day when they woke up, there was a moment where they were able to dream of a better future. And they were able to prepare, and they did prepare. They prepared with their songs and their dances and their musical instruments. And in this way, they found their Mary, their spirit of rebellion. They were going to rebel against oppression. And that would have been, only natural in such a circumstance. They would rebel against apathy. They would rebel against hopelessness. And the women prepared tambourines. And as bitter as their lives became, their faith only grew stronger. And this is the strength of Miriam, a feminine strength born out of bitterness. But this is the strength of all the women who left Egypt, who left Mitzrayim. They were equipped with tambourines. They were equipped with their dances, their songs, and they were equipped with this unbelievable faith and trust. I want to bring up on the screen a very, very powerful Gemara, a very powerful Talmud. And the Talmud writes that in the merit of the righteous women of that generation, our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt. And now I want to read the Rebbe's words directly, because I think reading the Rebbe's words is more powerful than anything else. And these were some clips that I cut and pasted from a talk, many different talks the Rebbe gave women, but I want to be able to make this all relevant to today's times, to today's generation. So I'm reading on the screen in the Rebbe's own words. The anxious anticipation for the redemption felt by Miriam and by all of the Jewish women was paralleled in its intensity by their exuberant celebration when, after the miracles of the Red Sea, the redemption was consummated. After the men joined Moses in song, the women broke out in song and dance, giving thanks to God with spirited rejoicing, which surpassed that of the men. Indeed, as they prepared to leave Egypt, the women were so confident that God would perform miracles on behalf of the Jewish people in the desert that they took small drums with them so they could rejoice when the time came. And the editors note that today, he wants to write, that many women are buying tambourines today in our generation for the anticipated occasion. And then I want to go on. Although we are still in exile, the confidence that the redemption is an imminent reality should inspire us with happiness. The experience of such happiness demonstrates the strength of our trust in the promise of the redemption, and the expression of this faith will in turn hasten its realization. And here, perhaps the punchline, the Talmud states that in the merit of the righteous women, the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. Similarly, the sages associated subsequent redemptions with the merit of Jewish women. We have been promised, as in the days of your exodus from Egypt, I will show you wonders. The Holy Ari emphasizes that the future redemption will follow the pattern of the Exodus, and thus we will also come as a result of the merit of the righteous women of that generation. So just to conclude, I think that there is something so powerful about us women and the power that we have. And in today's, the Rebbe, first and foremost, the Rebbe told us that it is that our generation is the reincarnation of the generation that left Egypt. So we know that our generation is going to, oh, Anita brought her tambourine. We know that our generation is going to be the generation that will witness Mashiach. We know that because that's what we've been promised. We know, but even more than that, just as in the times of the redemption from Egypt, it was the righteous women of that generation that it was in the merit of the righteous women of that generation that everyone merited to be redeemed. Our generation will be redeemed and we will witness Mashiach in the merit of us Jewish women. So in a time that we find ourselves in, COVID-19 or all the other craziness that's going on around us, if we can read more of the Rebbe's talks and inspire ourselves and start thinking more about Mashiach, and that hope and that dream will very soon become a reality. And Anita, I loved your tambourine, because I was going to propose that perhaps it's something that we should all do as a preparation for Mashiach's coming. Prepare a tambourine of our own, and decorate it beautifully, so that we are ready when Mashiach comes. We have our bags packed and our outfits picked out and our shoes picked out, and we'll be ready as soon as we're ready. So with that, I thank everybody for coming.